2008 in that department, a student of Prof. Tam. His area of specialization is language documentation, typology issues, and so on, and has done a lot of field work and work in northern Pakistan and across the border into Afghanistan. So his field work and doctoral dissertation stem from his work there on one language in particular, Malula. Is that right?
Correct, Malula.
Malula.
It's a Tonga language.
But he has wider interest than just documenting language. So he has been involved in language revitalization in that area that covers a wider spectrum in the Hindu Kush area. And I think that the paper today relates to that experience that he has in the wider area. Well, I think that we end it there. I was going to read the but I think you read the extended Dr. Leonid Grum, the audience.
Thank you very much, and a special thanks, of course, to Dr. Amuso and Professor Ampo for inviting us, and particularly inviting me to speak at this occasion. It's a great privilege, and it's the very first time I'm in Ghana, and the very first time I'm in Sub-Saharan Africa. So I intend to take you with me on a trip quite far away from your own region, but I also hope that there will be some sort of connecting links and that you will also recognize some things which are, I think, common to many parts of the world when it comes to multilingualism and the relationship or interrelationship between a number of languages in the same region. So I gave this talk the title, The Greater Hindu Kush Region and Its Linguistic Landscape, and it basically consists of three different parts. One part is just to give you a kind of background or overview over this region, and I soon define what I mean by it. The next part consists of giving some examples of language contact. How do these languages collaborate, or how do they function together? The third part is dedicated to what is more my own specialty, which is to do with aerial features and aeriality. This region in particular poses some problems, some challenges for defining an area. So I try to demarcate what this region is all about on this map. You have Pakistan here, you have Afghanistan, and then you have India. So it sort of touches the northeastern part of Afghanistan up here, a very mountainous area. This is the stronghold of Talibans and all sorts of people hiding up in these mountains. Northernmost Pakistan, which is also extremely mountainous. And it also touches on the northern parts of the disputed areas of Jammu and Kashmir. As you probably know, India and Pakistan have been fighting over the control of that area since independence. So this is not really an established term, Hindu Kush. There are many different names for talking about the same area. Some people will talk about Karakoram or the Western Himalayas. So you will see all sorts of terms being used. So what is it really that makes this area or this region significant? I would say that there are a few different things. I will point both to geography, to history, to culture, and also to linguistics, or the languages themselves. So I'd say a few words on each. Geography, as I said, it's characterized, the whole region is characterized by mountains. And when I say mountains, I mean mountains. They are 7,000, 8,000 meters high. Maybe you use feet here. So that you just triple that, okay? And deep valleys. And it's the valleys that are inhabited, of course. So the most part of this region is uninhabited, in actual fact. So you have near the rivers, near the streams, in the valleys you have villages and settlements. There are several important rivers here. Indus is the most important, and there are a number of tributaries to the Indus, like Kunar, Panchgora, Swat, Gilgit, Kishanganga. History was interesting. This region is really somewhere in between, and has been between a number of, how should I say, contending empires and contending powers. So on one side we have India, or what used to be British India, so the British power. On one side we have Russia, the Russian Empire. And here we have Chinese influence, or Chinese powers. And on that side we have Afghanistan. So in the 1800s there was something called the Great Game, which was really some sort of race towards getting control over this region. So no one has really entirely controlled the region as such. So they have had bits and pieces of it. There's also the famous Silk Road, which in some sense went through this region. The Silk Road connecting Europe, medieval Europe, with Eastern Asia, primarily China. Culture. As far as culture is concerned, the cultures of this region have much more in common with each other than they have with any of the surrounding bigger areas of the culture, such as South Asia or Central Asia. Most of the communities are solidly Muslim, which means that for most part they are 100% Muslim. That could mean Sunni, it could mean Shia for some of the groups. It could mean Ismailiya, which is another branch of Islam, which is quite strong in the north. There is one group in the far east of this region, spoken in Kashmir, that is also to some extent Buddhist. But the majority of all the languages are predominantly Muslim. There's actually one people group, the Kalasha. It's not what is displayed here, it's another group that represents a pre-Muslim religion. They number about 3,000 to 4,000, and it's the remains of a much more widespread pre-Muslim religion, or various different religious practices that were common in this region only 100 to 200 years ago. Okay, now let's get to languages. When it comes to languages at large, we could say that this region is where four important genera intersect. So on the one hand, we have Iranian, which is an Indo-European genus after all. We have Indo-Aryan, which is the majority of languages spoken in the Indian subcontinent. We have Tibeto-Burman, which also touches on this region, and we have Turkic in the north. So a belt of Turkish-related languages from Turkey in the west, all over to eastern or northeastern Asia, including Kyrgyz and Uzbek and Uyghur. The full list of languages spoken in this region is quite long. It's about 50 languages, and here you see that sort of split up. The largest component is the Indo-Aryan, and of that, there is a group of languages called Dardic, which is a disputed term. It's still used for convenience sake, and Burmanic references are there still to Dardic languages. I don't believe in it as a linguistic classification per se, but as a geographical term, it's quite practical. So we have Iranian, and then we have Nuristani, which is a third branch of the Indo-Iranian, which has been sort of recognized more recently. It's a group of languages, about 5 to 6 varieties of languages spoken in northeastern Afghanistan. And they were the last tribes to be converted in Afghanistan to Islam. Okay, there is also a language isolate, Burushaski, which has gained some fame in the world of linguistics as one of those languages which have never, no one has successfully been able to connect it genealogically with any other living languages in the world. So it remains a language isolate. There is, of course, widespread multilingualism. So these are all the languages plotted, and the different colors represent the different genera. So you see in the middle part here are the so-called Dardic languages. They sort of are at the center of my research and at the center of aerial configurations. When it comes to the genera and the distribution, it looks like this. In the middle we have Dardic languages, and we have Indo-Aryan non-Dardic languages in the south, which are basically, they belong to a cluster of languages related to Punjabi, which is a major language of Pakistan. Nuristani, as I mentioned before, Iranian. Here in the south, it's mainly represented by Pashto. Pashto is also a large language. I'll get back to that later. Spoken by some 20 million people in the borderlands between Afghanistan and Pakistan. We also have Turkic, which is not really part of it. It's spoken at the fringes of this region, but it might have been more important in the past. And we have Tibeto-Burman, which is represented by two different, more or less two different varieties. One is called Balti, spoken on Pakistani territory, and Kurik on the Indian side, and Burushaski up there in the north. Most researchers would hold that Burushaski once was spoken in a much larger area. So it's probably that if we are talking about any truly indigenous language, which has been there for a very long time, we probably have to point to Burushaski. When it comes to linguistic work in this region, it was very much pioneered during the British time. We find, for instance, a massive work such as the Linguistic Survey of India, which was compiled by Grierson at the beginning of the 1900s. He was representative of that generation of British officials that were officials, political agents, but also dedicated linguists. That sort of was part of that culture in those years. Actually, there are modern day Pakistanis who actually complain and say with some sort of regret that our officials today, they don't really care about the local languages. They don't care learning about the local languages where they are posted. Whereas the British officials, they actually did. And they were deeply interested in documenting those languages. Well, for shady purposes sometimes, but they did it. Okay, so we also have a number of British colonial reports of various quality. The real pioneer, though, was a Norwegian linguist, Georg Morgenstjerne, who traveled in this region, both in Afghanistan and what was British India in those days, documenting languages, describing them very, very professionally. Some of the articles that he wrote in the 1930s, 1940s is still of very high quality, and he had a good ear. He had done his phonetics. He knew very well what he was talking about. Even after independence, the majority of descriptions are, I would say, unfortunately, dominated very much by Western or foreign scholars, particularly when it comes to northern Pakistan. In northeastern Afghanistan, there is a mix of Western and Soviet scholars up to the 1980s, when everything sort of collapsed when it came to scholarly research in that region due to conflict and wars. In Kashmir, a number of Indian scholars have been actively involved in linguistic description and documentation, and as well as a few Western scholars. There was an extensive SIL, Summer Institute of Linguistics survey in Pakistan's mountain region that was carried out in the 1990s. And that was some sort of a starting point for a new generation of linguistic research to be carried out. There was a 5-volume series. It contained a lot of social linguistic information, was based on surveys, questionnaires. It also contained a word list, a Swedish type of word list from a large number of locations in this region. So in all, it covered about 30 languages. There was a continued SIL, National Institute of Pakistan Studies collaboration. This is a study center under the State University in Islamabad, the Quaid-e-Azam University. So that was also kind of successful collaboration which produced a number of descriptive studies. I've been part myself of forming or establishing something called the Forum for Language Initiatives. It's a non-profit organization. It's not an educational organization per se. It's more a resource center for the many languages of the region, particularly in northern Pakistan. People involved in this center are often native speakers of languages, and they have a heart for their own languages, for their own people, for the documentation of their oral history, of their vocabulary, and also historical accounts that they see are now disappearing as the oral tradition has come to sort of discontinuation. So they would like to have these kind of things written down, recorded, etc. So much of the work going on within the Forum for Language Initiative also has to do with mother tongue literacy, mother tongue curriculum development, the publication of what is interesting for the local population very often, like local proverbs, collections, local history, accounts of the local history. There are a number of important social linguistic contributions by a professor called Tariq Rahman, who was also the founder of the linguistics department in Islamabad that was established only a few years ago. There are also some advances in computational linguistics at an institute in Lahore. But that's about it when it comes to linguistics in Pakistan. So it's really only in its beginning stages. Some current key factors that some of you might be aware of already, probably you are aware of them, are that Pakistan and Afghanistan are facing a turbulent external kind of crisis, civil unrest in many cases, ambivalent official attitudes, and this is regarding linguistic research. It is not really, or has not really been okay from the official standpoint to focus too much on regional or local languages, because that is often seen as in competition with promoting Urdu, which is the national language, the glue that brings people together. Because there are very few things that really unite a country such as Pakistan. Religion and a common language are those two very important symbolic factors. So there is overall a weak linguistic tradition, but there is an increasing academic interest. There is also a growing body of national scholars, some of whom are educated abroad in Britain and in the US primarily. Some of them have returned and are active in linguistic research in Pakistan today. Whereas I would say the large proportion of scholars being educated with a Pakistani origin actually remain abroad. There is also an increasing focus on mother tongue education and local language development, which is gaining some sort of acceptance even from the political level. So now I'm moving into the area that has to do with language contact, and some of you are experts in this area, and I won't be able to give a lot of detail at this point. There's a lot to be said, so you will maybe find it a bit superficial, but I'll try my best. So the point of interest and where I've gained most of my experience is in a place called Chitral. It's a district in northern Pakistan, but it is also a former principality. So up to 1969, they actually had a king. So it was recognized as a state within the state. So the state of Chitral was sort of a part, a region that had joined Pakistan on their own will. Multilingualism here is the norm rather than anything exceptional. Very few of the languages are written, and those that are written have only very recently started using a written form. I will give examples of polyglossia in a village or a valley called Ashret, which is the main settlement where I've done field work. Morgenstern, the Norwegian linguist I talked about before, he described this place as one of the most polyglot regions of Asia. Starting from sort of below, what is spoken in people's homes and spoken by all generations and also transferred to the next generation is a speech that is basically called our speech, Asichola. It's a form of speech shared by the descendants of two men that lived about 15 to 16 generations ago. They were called Chok and Machok. And there's a genealogy. The genealogy is very important. The whole valley consists of, or comprises 11 clans, and all of these 11 clans are descended from the same two guys.
Did they have any women there? Women.
Women?
Did they have any women?
No, there are no women.
Oh.
Only two guys.
Only two guys, exactly. We don't, there are no women mentioned in those genealogies. There should be. Okay. Next, which is also sort of, if we talk about the scale of low, middle, high, where we talk about language status, the next station would be Aula, which is the common language, or the language that the inhabitants of Ashret share with another valley, Biori. This has been written for about 10 years, and it's also taught in 2 schools in the Ashret Valley. People are generally, when I first came there, people were almost reluctant to speak their own language in front of people that were not speakers of it. They were, I would say, ashamed of being pointed out as Padula speakers. So if they left their village to go to the nearest bazaar town, Drosh, they would either keep quiet throughout their stay, or they would speak very quietly with each other, or they would even switch over to another language that was more widely spoken. They were very sensitive to being pointed out as villagey people or forest people, so a very low self-esteem when it comes to the language. Pashto, or Pashto, is the mother tongue of probably more than 20 million people, and it's the largest language also of the province where, of which Chitral is a part. It is the language of trade. It is the language of most of the people driving buses, vehicles, merchants. So whenever you need to buy and sell stuff, it's essential to know Pashto. It's not learned in schools. It's not learned as a medium of instruction. Instead, it is a language that is almost always learned the informal way. And even though it is a status language in one sense, because it has a large number of speakers, it's looked upon as slightly unsophisticated. But in the Ashuret Valley, for instance, it has an important function because it was through Pashto speakers that Islam was introduced in the area. So on the one hand, it's a rough, tough language. On the other hand, it's an important language to learn and be able to communicate in. There's a kind of ambiguous attitude to the language. Khowar is a smaller language than Pashto. It's also an Indo-Aryan language. Pashto is an Iranian language, so it's more difficult actually, or more different from the Palula speaker's point of view to learn it than Khowar. But Khowar is still a very distinct language. Most officials in the district are mother tongue Khowar speakers. So doing official business requires some sort of knowledge in Khowar. Contrary to Pashto, it is considered more sophisticated for various reasons, historical reasons. The rulers of this district, the Mehtar or the king, was, for instance, a Khowar speaker. So most people also going to school would come across Khowar because many of the teachers are Khowar speakers. Next language in line, which is really on the status high, I would say, is Urdu. Urdu is by effect the national language. This is the lingua franca of the whole country. So wherever you go, you can be expected to, you can expect to speak Urdu and be understood. However, Urdu is not the official language. So it is the language of media, it is the language of newspapers, it is the language of film. But when it comes to documents, official documents, legislation, higher education, English is the language. English remains high prestige even after, 60 years of independence, and anyone with any aspiration beyond local employment would have to master English. There are also English medium schools. Most state schools, most government schools are Urdu medium, and they introduce English later, whereas most private schools use English medium as a way of attracting students. A problem with that is that most teachers teaching English are not really competent. So even I have a problem communicating in English if I want to do that with teachers of English. You can imagine that the level is a problem there. So on the one hand you say, we offer English medium education, but they are very, very dependent on school books, curriculum, etc. for the students to learn English from. And it's very much by rote memorization, by rote learning, rather than actually acquiring communication skills in the language. Al-Arabiya. Arabic is a language of religion. It's not really the mother tongue of any population other than small immigrant populations in Pakistan. All of the languages in this region share a large body of Arabic or combination with Persian often, but Arabic derived vocabulary. So in the area of administration, religion, etc., abstract terms, they are often derived from Arabic. Okay, those are basically the languages that people in Ashret come across. There are other languages that might have some sort of importance. One is Persian. Persian was actually the school language and the administrative language up till the 1960s. It was considered a language of learning, so older people would still be able to read Persian. They would appreciate Persian poetry, for instance, as very sophisticated. It's considered a very stylish language. And even Urdu in itself is very much influenced by Persian and Persian vocabulary. Another language that some people in Ashret come across is Dameli, is the language of the next valley. But there are few people that master both of the languages to any larger extent. So they might know a few of the words in either direction, because there is really no relationship between Palula and Dameli as high, low, or one of them having higher status than the other. They are confined to their own settlements, to their own valleys. Okay, I move quickly into another area, which has to do with areality. The Hindu Kush region is traditionally seen as being included in a larger South Asian linguistic area of Shpati. So there are a number of features that we find all over India, or all over former British India, that are shared by more or less all the languages. But then that in its turn is part of an even larger configuration, which is sometimes called the Indo-Turanian macro area, where certain features, particularly in the area of syntax and word order, are shared by basically all the languages in this very, very large area. So I point to a few of them. One is OV constituent order, so you have verb final order. You find that in Persian. You find that in Uyghur, which is a Turkic language. So what is here in bold type is really the verb. You find it in Hindko, an Indo-Aryan language. You find it in Manchu, which is the Tungusic language, far up in the northeast of that macro area. And you find it in Dravidian in South India. I won't go into details there. There are a number of other OV-related features also that we find. Complex predicate constructions are very, very numerous in this whole macro area, where you form predicates by a verb, a simple verb, combined with either an adjective or a noun or something similar to that. We find examples even in a language isolated as Burushaski, where basically shaving your beard is expressed like I did my beard or I made my beard. It's of course common all over the world with these kind of light verb constructions, as they are sometimes called, but they are very, very numerous in this in the vocabulary of most of the languages of this macro area. Converb constructions in complex sentences is another one, where you express something that is, I would say, functionally in between coordination and dependency construction. So they worked for an extra hour and then went home from the cotton field, which is basically expressed as working or having worked for an extra half hour. They went home from the cotton field. Again, we find that in many different languages of various genera. Okay, when it comes to South Asia, a feature that is shared by all of the languages of the Hindu Kush region is retroflexion. We are mainly familiar from South Asia with retroflexion, retroflex plosives. So you have d and d, etc. But retroflexion is there in many parts of the phonological systems. Another areal feature that is shared with South Asia is non-nominative experience constructions. So things like sleeping or feeling hot would be expressed as a goal construction very often. So sleep came to me, or heat came to me. These are from Pashto. You find similar structures in many of the languages. Compound verbs is different from what I explained before, the other complex predicates. Here we actually use two verbs. So there are similarities with serial verb constructions here, but traditionally they are described as compound verbs in South Asia. They're fading out in Hindu Kush region, so they are not at all as common there as in South Asia at large. In Palula, for instance, there are a few verb-verb combinations that are really productive. So, like here, garriero, which is removing something, basically taking off, throwing it. In other respects, the Hindu Kush area shares areal features with parts of Central Asia. So, for instance, many of them are syntactically left branching, which means that you have a dependent clause that comes sequentially before the main clause. I won't go into that now. Another thing that links this area with another area, this is different, is the absence or even weakening of gender distinctions. So we find that even in Indo-Aryan languages that are very strong, generally speaking, very strong gender languages. And when I say very strong, it is masculine, feminine gender distinctions. What we find in a language called Kalasha, that's actually the language of the last remaining non-Muslim population that I mentioned before, where this has been replaced by an animacy differentiation instead. I don't know how easy it is to see, but if we look at the number of the languages here plotted, we see that most of the languages have a two-gender differentiation, the blue ones. But up here in the northwest, a number of the languages instead don't have any gender distinctions at all. So this is linking it with an area to the west, primarily represented by Turkic languages and also Persian, that also are genderless. We have a red dot there, that's Burushaski. They are having a four-gender system. So that comes close to more what we find in languages here of this area. Agent marking is another thing, but that is linking the languages here to the east. So the languages of the eastern part of the Hindu Kush region, they have the same features as Tibeto-Burman languages that are close to them geographically. So for instance, Gilgit-Shina is Indo-Aryan, and it has an ergative or agentive marking that is there regardless of tense, regardless of aspect, which is very uncommon otherwise for Indo-Aryan languages. Even form-wise, it's very similar to the closest Tibeto-Burman language. So you see se, si. So researchers have, for good reasons I would say, suggested that this is a loan from Tibeto-Burman into Gilgit-Shina. So you see the red dots there, they represent agent marking which is agent marking regardless of tense and aspect. There is agent marking in other areas as well. Uvular consonants, that's not typically a part of South Asia. Instead, it's a part of Central Asia, and some of the languages in the far north of our region of interest also share this feature. I'll skip over some of that. Another thing which is more, I would say, typical of this region, so now we are getting to real areal or sub-areal features, is something I call complex spatial differentiation. So for instance, in Palula, there is a distinction made between what is here, what is there, and what is over there, which is not visible. So this is a distinction between visibility and non-visibility, and here is between what is right here and between what is over there. But then in addition to that, there are a number of other finer distinctions that are used in pronouns, that are used in adverbs, to some extent also in the verbal area. So for instance, these directions are often very important when pointing out where something is, where someone is. Undera is right up. Agera is somewhere up there. Unera is there. You can also express that something is here in opposition to across a river or across a gorge. So Ora is here, whereas Harera is there. But you can also elaborate those with further distinctions, such as between Harera and Harera. So just the vowel length there makes a further distinction of something even further away, but still visible. So these things we find in language after language, and it is tempting to attribute this to geographical features. So mountains, etc., and the importance of keeping track of where you are and where things are, where people are. This is a final example of what could define the area. Well, I point to one other thing that I think is important. We have numeral systems that are based on 20, which you find in other parts of the world as well. But what is significant here is that all the languages in this region share this feature. Whereas in the neighboring regions, some languages do, other languages don't. So we have a concentration of vigesimal numeral systems here. So you count like 20, 2010, 220, 22010, etc., 320. We'll go to the very last slide here, which is skipping over a lot of stuff. I would say that there are possibly no features that are exclusive to this region and are shared by all the languages. So features are either, and here I'm borrowing terminology from Masika, where he describes area configurations as often very overlapping areas, areas that are more sub-regional, etc. So we have features that are either macroareal, that the region shares with a very large macro area, such as almost the entire Asia. We have areal features, which this region shares with either South Asia or with Central Asia. And then there are linking features that only link parts of the region with an adjacent region. And we have sub-regional features. So I didn't exemplify that here, we didn't really have time for it, but one of them is zero-marked nominal plurality, for instance. Another one is a 20-base system. Another one is the spatial differentiation. So what is typical is the transitional nature of the region. So it's really at the borderlands or the crossroads of different areas, linguistic-wise. A few of those features may be traces of shared substrata, so that might be Gruszewski, for instance, and more pervasive context effects in the past. Alternatively, we could identify this as an ancient residual zone. but one which has sort of been splitting up for a very long time. So it might be a zone that have in the past shown an enormous amount of diversity, but now it's becoming more and more similar. The languages are in various ways becoming more similar to one another, and often attributed to the influence of larger lingua franca. So that's my conclusion.
Thank you for that very investigation, very complete. It's time for comment, questions. We didn't start early, so we pushed it out that we have a few questions and comments. Yeah.
I had a comment. You mentioned a grouping that you said was more geographical than, indicative of like a family. I was wondering what methodology you were appealing to in order to distinguish shared aerial features from clear genetic, features.
Yeah. When it comes to that Dardic classification, the argumentation is often along lines of features that are really conservative. So they have to do with retention rather than development. So it's very difficult to find features that combine all of those so-called Dardic languages and say that this is something that is innovation in all of the languages. So the things that are often common to them are very conservative features in comparison with other invariant languages. So one would be, for instance, three different fricatives, where you have an alveolar fricative, you have a palatal fricative, and you have a retroflex fricative. And that would often be one of the arguments used for identifying this as a grouping on their own. But it really fails because this kind of three sibilant or three fricative division is found already in, for instance, old invariant, that would be Sanskrit, for instance. So there's nothing new about it, it's just that it has been preserved. Pointing to things like the 20-base system would be, in a sense, more fruitful. But then, on the other hand, that is a feature shared with languages that are not Dardic, which would draw the point to an aerial feature. Even if, but let's say that the source of it would be the invariant languages or the Dardic languages. But there's no way of proving it because you have it in Gurushevsky as well. Some sort of an answer.
Just a follow-up. Like in the African situation, we have a lot of mass comparison from Greenberg. So look at 1,000 languages, most of them have G, and then we reconstruct G. In the groupings there, is that also mass comparison? Is there more comparative method trying to tease out the differences between, one or two languages and showing how they derive from a source? Like, what's the state of reconstruction, historical linguistic reconstruction?
I would say that quite a lot of work has gone into reconstruction just because of invariant languages have sources. I mean, we have all the different stages of invariant are documented. I mean, from Vedic through intermediary stages, middle invariant to new invariant languages. So I think researchers generally have a pretty good picture of that. So what we are really lacking is comparison across genera. So aerial comparisons. And the lack in this particular region is the lack of good documentation. So even if we have documentation for, let's say, invariant languages outside of the region, is much more scanty when it comes to this region.
Yes.
I may have missed this maybe from the beginning, but can you please throw more light on what went into the classification of the various, classifying them into medium, low, high, and are these official classifications or?
No, it's not official.
Can I ask my question since it's kind of related? Yeah, I mean, you talked about the different domains of usage and so on, but I didn't get the extent of the contact. For instance, if you took a regular secondary level educated person in that day, what would be the languages in his or her repertoire, and what's the extent of interaction and use?
And also if you are a woman.
Good
What
point.
happens to you?
Yeah, so I answer your question first. This is actually based on a person who did a study on COAR, money. His name is Money. So he recognized these features, high, mid, low, on basis, mainly on the basis of exposure, on attitudes, so it has to do mainly with attitudes to the languages. It's partly based on questionnaires, asking a number of questions about marriage patterns, for instance, preferred languages in the homes. So all of these kind of things go into this classification. So it's a whole package of attitudinal features.
I had a related question. So whether a language is written as orthography is not part of it?
Not so much, because the only languages with a written language that is standardized in any way are Urdu and English. And they are both sort of in the high status, really.
Well, Pashto too, but they don't.
Exactly, Pashto is a written language, but most people have never come across Pashto as a written language. So even though you have a population of 20 million speakers, a fraction of them have come across their own language as a written language. The first language they come across as a written language is usually Urdu. And Pashto has been used much more in the past, even as a medium of instruction, but that has ceased sort of to be the case. Now, back to your question about sort of the average person. Someone going to school, having been to school for about, just say, 4 or 5 years, would have acquired, apart from their own language, Palula, they would have acquired a fair amount of COAR, mainly because, as I said before, teachers are COAR speaking, and there are also relatives in the district that they communicate with. Every time they have to go outside of the village, they also come across COAR. So many would, at that age, have an exposure to, for instance, by going to district capital, where the dominant language would be COAR, and they would know a number of COAR speakers by that age also. They would also know Pashto, but to a very varying extent, because Pashto would not be a language they come across in school necessarily. So that would be in the bazaar, in dealing with people, or listening to people, driving buses and vehicles, selling things. Urdu, they would have come across as a medium of instruction. They would know basic communication in Urdu. They would know reading and writing. So that would be the only language they have any skills of when it comes to written written texts. English would come later for most kids in that village. And this, I would say, is regardless of whether they are girls or boys nowadays. So to the question about women, yes, women are probably the only group where you find a substantial number of monolingual individuals. So you would find very, very few monolingual men, because in this society, men are the ones working outside their village, traveling, purchasing things from the bazaar. Women wouldn't do that. Women don't sell. There are no saleswomen at all, for instance. Only men you find in the bazaar. It's a very gender-divided society. So women who have only stayed at home or around their home, which is a normal case, would have picked up very little of any other languages. If they have picked up languages, it is because they have relatives or in-laws that speak another language. As a woman, normally in this region, you're expected to learn the language of your in-laws, not the other way around. But there are exceptions. In areas where Palula is weak, there are actually strategic marriages, which means that the parents of a boy say, okay, we need to find a Khor-speaking wife, because we want our family to be able to be more fluent in this more useful language. People are very pragmatic when it comes to languages. So in that case, it's actually agreed that a wife will come in and stay with her husband and with her in-laws and actually continue speaking her own language, which is in a way against the traditional way of looking at it. But here you make it an exception because it's a higher status language. It would never be the other way around. Yes.
Are there languages that are threatened due to neglect from government or?
Basically all languages are neglected by the government except Urdu and English. But so I wouldn't say that the neglect, it's not the neglect itself that makes languages threatened. It has more to do with attitudes. The languages that are really threatened is where another language has already a presence in a village, for instance, and is taking over to the extent that parents don't think is worth anymore transmitting their own language. So that's the only point, I would say, where any of the languages are really threatened. So I wouldn't say that the majority of the languages in this region are threatened, but languages, there are maybe a handful of them that have very, very few speakers and that are not anymore majority languages in one and the same village. So as long as it's a majority language in the village or in the settlement, it's fine. I mean, it might be fine for 1 or 2 more generations. But in those cases where there is a massive amount of intermarriage, for this reason I described before, that language is definitely threatened.
How do you explain the shared features? You're talking about now completely different languages, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then they have all these features.
Yes.
Is this due to just contact, or is it what is going on? Do you have any theory on this? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It depends a little bit on what features we are talking about, of course. I would say that multilingualism has always been a feature of this region, so it's not really anything new. What is new is really the languages that are the main vehicle for that sort of contact. I mean, nowadays, I would say Urdu and English are those carriers of change. But I would say
What
in
about
the past.
What about Arabic?
Vocabulary-wise, yes. But not structurally. I have hard to think of any features that has to do with anything else than purely lexical loans that are from an Arabic derived source. And also due to the fact that Arabic is not really a spoken language in the region. I mean, people are not familiar with Arabic-speaking peoples at all. I mean, they know Arabic because they have been to a Quranic school, for instance, learning to recite the Quran. They have learned some religious terms, but very, very few people who know anything about Arabic grammar, Arabic morphology, syntax, etc. So there's only insertion of lexical material, and those are shared by a large number of languages. And I would say that often, for instance, when it comes to Palula, they have been transmitted through Pashto. And very often there is a second stage where Pashto has taken them over from another intermediate language between Pashto and Arabic. So there are sort of layers there. I would say that's the case, for instance, with the complex predicates also, which is not, I mean, that doesn't have anything to do with Arabic, but it is a feature that is shared, for instance, by Iranian languages and Indo-Aryan languages. So it's a very common feature in Hindi and Urdu, and I would say that it's even more pervasive in L2 usage of those languages. So let's say that you have a simple verb for something that often comes with its own conjugation, with its own set of inflections, whereas you often have a corresponding construction which is complex, where you use a very generic verb, such as give or take, along with a noun, which gives you the option of actually choosing a more simple morphology, a morphology that you could apply to very many different predicates. So this is sort of the rationale for acquiring those constructions, and you often find them as calques from one language to another. So there are many calques that are direct from Pashto to Palula, for instance, where you have the corresponding noun. I mean, the noun itself might in some cases be borrowed, but not necessarily. And then you have the verb for do, or for give, or for take. So that combination is a direct reflection of one another, whereas the actual vocabulary might be, in some cases, different. In some cases, it is the noun that is directly borrowed or a form of it.
Thank you. There's a notion developed by one Malcolm Ross in Australia for something like what we are describing in the method. He used that very well to explain how very different languages tend now to have similar structures in the Pacific area, particularly in Papua New Guinea, where they have several different languages now having similar kinds of structures. That might be a notion to look at. He actually outlined the processes involved in the changes that finally, and the driving wheel might be the language, the lingua franca, or you would call a nomadic language. And so somehow, this processes may tend to maybe drive the alignment from maybe SVO to SOV, just because of the pattern you might find in the nomadic language. Probably that may, he was talking about explanation.
Yes.
Might be relevant to what we're looking at here in the data.
Yeah, thank you. I will look into that.
anymore. We are very close. No more. Thank you very much for very interesting. But this is not the end yet. I was just about to say that he is not done. He is continuing today. Today is his day. At 2:30, he will come back here. This time, kind of lecturer, student,
More interactive.
more interactive on the topic. So everybody is invited. So the graduate students, first year medicine is compulsory. PhD students, other students, optional, but I think all of you need to hear what that language documentation, related to field work documentation, and some key factors in language revitalization. That's the topic. So we all invited, but for the first years, we were important. And remember tomorrow's just lecture by Dr. Manuel. Always and
for tomorrow the title is Lexical Typology and Lexical Universals, and I'll pronounce it by Maria Otieskaya. Wow. Yes, and then those in my morphology PhD class. Tomorrow is the Maison Française, not Française. Maison Française at the regional Amono building from 3 p.m. tomorrow. Come and listen to Lexical Typology and Lexical Universals. And then, importantly, listen to me. For those in my morphology PhD class, I promised you that I was going to make a request of Professor Maria come to give us a lecture on nominalization. It's one of the topics we're going to treat in the course of the semester. But she wrote her PhD 1988 on nominalizations, and you cannot write on nominalization without citing her. She wrote the entry in Encyclopedia of Language and Linguistics on nominalization. And she's agreed to teach us next week. So from 8:30 next week, we have a lecture on nominalization. I'm inviting all the master students to, because somehow some of you end up writing on nominalization.
You can't avoid it.
You can't avoid it. Yes, and those who are writing on nominalization and word formation generally, you must be there. So that is next Wednesday, 8:30 to 10:30. Before that, we may use this place on the PhD room, depending on what is going on here. But definitely we'll have that lecture. Don't miss it. Then after that, next week, he was going to make that announcement, but we've forgotten the title. But they will give us. We are giving a talk.
Yeah, on normalization.
So it's Upper, Kambong, and Tuya.
Yeah, serial verb nominalization in Akan, and we're dealing with intervening elements, whether it's a nominal marker or a conditional marker or a temp marker, because aspects, some type of marker. So we'll tease out some of those things immediately following.
So there is going to be a lot of nominalization between now and when they leave next. Yes. So what we're going to do, I'm going to give you the material from Language and Linguistics, the encyclopedia, the material to read before the lecture so you can follow it. And whatever else she's going to recommend, I'll read them available by close of day today. So you read the material before next Wednesday.
So do I have an hour or 2 hours?
And it's 2 hours.